We are moving on to our third speaker of today's session, this morning's session. We move on to Samyukta Manikuma. Samyukta is an amateur astronomer from Nairobi. She is currently a member of the IDA International Committee. She works on designing experiences to help people connect with darkness in the night sky and hopes to harness the dark skies to promote sustainability, nature conservation, and heritage preservation. Samyukta will present her lessons learned from introducing an astrotourism project pilot project, and on how to talk about light pollution in a way that makes people care. So her presentation is called Astrotourism and Reframing Perceptions of Darkness. And with that, I'd like to welcome Samyukta Manikuma.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was muted. It's going to be a tough act to follow the last two presentations, but I'm going to do my best. My name is Samyukta. I'm from Kenya, and I work on designing experiences to help people protect the night sky. And I'm also an amateur astronomer. I'm very grateful to be here today to talk about astrotourism in Kenya, specifically about the implementation of an astrotourism pilot project in Kenya, and how astrotourism relates to dark sky advocacy. So the approach to dark sky advocacy is pretty clear in the developed world. In places where there's a visible excess of light, the approach is generally to highlight the problems associated with improper and excessive artificial lighting. But in Africa, especially in a place like Kenya, light pollution is still far from this detrimental kind of excess. Most parts of Kenya are already very dark from a lack of infrastructure. And in places like this, darkness indicates a lack of development, a lack of progress. And artificial light, because of the infrastructural symbols that come with it, like tall buildings and streetlights, is seen as something to aspire to. So in a place like this, how do we get people to care about light pollution? And how do we get them engaged to protect the dark? I'm going to segue a little and talk about the pilot project. So a group of us Kenyans received funding to start an astronomy for development project, pilot project in Kenya. 10 of us were part of the third Kenyan cohort of the Development in Africa with Radio Astronomy, or DARA program. So we were funded by DARA through the IAU Office of Astronomy for Development to come up with a project that used astronomy to target some of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. We called ourselves and our project Sayari, which is the Swahili word for planet. And we started thinking about how we could use astronomy to tackle Kenya's unique problems. So a few key things we noted about Kenya were that the economy relies heavily on tourism, especially on nature tourism and cultural tourism. But in spite of Kenya's economic success, at least before the pandemic, there are also some serious economic problems. We have very high rates of youth unemployment, about 15%, and really high rural poverty rates, about 36%, which is improving slowly, but there's definitely room for a lot of change. So we started wondering, is there a way to solve these problems in Kenya using astronomy, and more importantly, using things that Kenya already has? Kenya has abundant dark skies, especially in more rural areas. It's really only the cities that are starting to show signs of light pollution for now. It's also mostly at a high altitude with really dry air, which means pretty beautiful night skies. And we're also located on the equator, which gives Kenya access to northern and southern skies throughout the year. So when I say these things, for many of you, the first word that comes to your mind now is probably astrotourism, which is exactly what we thought. The astrotourism industry is still very new to Kenya. There are a few people offering astrotourism services, but there's still lots of potential to create new jobs by capitalizing on the features that I mentioned before, the dryness, the altitude, and relative darkness. And there also isn't the need for much additional infrastructural investment. So we looked at the role that safari guides play in Kenya. Safari is the Swahili word for travel. I'm not talking about the browser. And safari guides are the tour guides that take people through game reserves and through protected areas, and they give them knowledge about the landscape. So the safari guides are points of contact, essentially the mediators between the visiting tourists and the cultural and natural landscape of Kenya. And we thought that if we as Sayari offer astrotourism services ourselves, we won't reach as many people as we would if we trained these safari guides, these points of contact. So the idea was to give the guides astronomy skills to open up this astrotourism segment of the tourism market. And these skills would also fit in well with their current skills and what they already do. What they do is they help people to understand the nature and the culture of Kenya. But the night sky, as we know, is also a natural asset. It houses an entire nocturnal environment and ecosystem. And there's also a rich cultural relationship of different Kenyan tribes to objects in the night sky. Phase 1 of our pilot project happened in 2018 and 2019. We trained 10 safari guides at 2 camps over 2 weeks in the Masai Mara Game Reserve in Kenya. So on the left here, you can see the Maasai guide being trained to use a mobile sky map application. The Maasai are just one of the 44 tribes in Kenya. They're probably the most famous. But our training basically consisted of theory lessons during the day. And we had practical sessions at night where the guides could kind of integrate and try out what they learned during the day. We designed the curriculum around core skills in astronomy. So these skills were in astronomy theory, things like cosmic distances, the basic science behind different objects, and object classifications. We also gave the guides skills in a practical observational astronomy. So the basics of celestial mechanics from the equator, because we're on the equator, and how to predict the movement of different things in the sky to know where things rise and set and the path that they take through the sky. That's important knowledge for observing. We also gave each lodge a 6-inch reflector telescope to use, and we taught them some telescope basics as well so that they could assemble and use the telescopes by themselves after the training. Aside from the course astronomy skills, we also gave guides presentations about ethnoastronomy from different tribes in Kenya and the rest of Africa. Like I mentioned before, Kenya has a rich cultural relationship with the night sky. And many tribes use objects in the night sky for timing rituals and predicting events, but also for more practical down-to-earth purposes like timing harvests and predicting the start and end of the rainy season. We also introduced dark sky conservation and some reasons why the night needs to be protected. Dark sky conservation is pretty new to Kenya because, as I mentioned, the situation in most parts of Kenya is not really at a problematic level. But regardless, we went through some basic information with the guides about the general need for darkness and the problems of artificial lighting. So the lessons from this phase of Sayari were twofold. Firstly, for a new industry and the hopes of reaching a new market, our training had maybe a bit too much information. Safari guides have different education levels, especially of physics and natural science. And it's very hard to teach all of basic theoretical astronomy in 2 weeks to people without a solid science base. It's much harder when it's also combined with all the other skills that we were trying to teach them. But the second, more optimistic lesson was that there was a lot of interest in knowledge that was more local, like light pollution and ethnoastronomy. Guides were very interested in things that had a direct relationship to them, things involving culture, and even how the absence of the dark impacts them and their own biology. We actually found that in many cases it was less like a training and more of a dialogue where we were, when we were discussing these topics, we were actually like learning anecdotes and cultural stories from them as we were teaching them. So armed with these lessons, we attempted phase 2 of the training. This was post-pandemic. We trained one guide, Peter Kamau, who was interested in upskilling post-pandemic and also interested in sustainable tourism and ecotourism. Peter also runs his own travel company. So for Peter's training was completely online. We removed all the astronomy theory and telescope content and decided to focus on expanding ethnoastronomy and really focusing the light pollution content on the ecological impacts of light pollution. We realized that safari guides have a very delicate understanding of the ecosystems and the interactions of different organisms. And they were in a good position to comprehend how it affects ecology. And we also felt that this curriculum was a much better balance of the material compared to the first training, and definitely much more doable in 2 weeks. So Peter's astro guiding skills and his confidence improved measurably after this training. He was able to keep up with the material, and he also confirmed to us what we'd learned before, that the most interesting topics to guides and to tourists are the locally relevant components, the ethnoastronomy and the ecological impacts of light pollution. Peter hasn't been able to test out his skills on guests yet, since the tourism sector has been pretty badly hit by the pandemic in Kenya, and it's working hard to bounce back. But these trainings have taught us that there's definitely a gap in the market that we hope to address in the future. So some future plans for Sayari include refresher trainings for the camps that we previously trained. And we're also looking at packaging the course so it can be taught at hospitality schools and guiding associations in Kenya. This experience has also highlighted the lack of light pollution research in Kenya. This is something I'm personally working to remedy. I created this database with existing research on the effects of light pollution on species studied elsewhere in the world that are also local to Kenya. It's just cross-referenced information, but my hope is that it will start a conversation and encourage some on-the-ground and direct local research of light pollution on ecosystems in Kenya. The database is still in early stages and it's being updated constantly, but you can access it at the link here. I'll pop it in the chat later as well. So through our work and through the Sayari pilot project, we discovered something that all the people fighting for the dark already know, but we realized that it's also true for Kenya, that darkness holds incredible potential for connection, for environmental preservation, heritage preservation, and for economic growth. But we also stumbled upon an interesting answer to the initial question. How do we get people to care about light pollution in Kenya? And the answer for us wasn't to talk about the problems of light, but to plant the seed for and to cultivate a relationship to the dark and a sensitivity to it through creating economic opportunity in darkness and also creating experiences of connection to heritage, to beauty, and to awe. By making people sensitive to the dark and everything it has to give us, people will care for it and they will protect it. So perhaps this is something we can add to our collective advocacy toolbox to restore the natural night sky. We can try to create the conditions for people to connect to the dark, and maybe the rest will just fall into place. Thank you so much for making the time to listen to me. A special thank you to the IDA for this opportunity and to the entire Sayari team for making this happen.